So I've been making bows now for about 18 months. And if I'm unkind to myself, I would say that I've spent all that time making good wood into bad bows. So the question today is, in those 18 months, have I learned enough for me now to be able to make a good bow out of a bad piece of wood? Like this. This is a piece of yew brought down in recent high winds. It's the kind of thing that any sensible bowyer would turn into firewood. But instead, I just wonder if I can make a bow out of it. Now, if there is a bow in this piece of yew, the first problem is figuring out where it is, because it's covered in knots, stumps where there were branches, it's not straight. You've only got to take a close look to see how bad this piece of yew is. Look, there's a branch erupting from here, and here, and here, and here, and here. It's truly awful. But for better or for worse, I've decided that this is going to be the belly of this wonky bow. I've marked it with felt tip pen, and now I'm going to start work shaping this bow with a machete. Oh, and so you know, this piece of yew is green, wet and unseasoned. So after I've trimmed it down into a bow shape, I'm going to put it indoors to accelerate the drying process. Okay, so that's the belly work down now on this wonky stave of yew. Full of knots and horrible twists and turns. No idea whether really there will be a bow in this piece of wood. It's still enormously thick. There's lots of wood left, but I'm not worried about that at the moment. My next job is to work on this, the width of the bow stave. And that's going to be a bit more of a challenge. I can't just cut it with a machete, because somehow I've got to follow this heartwood, which twists and wiggles and turns all the way up the stave. I've marked the centre line of the heartwood all the way along the length of this stave, just to give my eye a guide as I start work thinning down the sides of this stave. And for a start, I'll use a spoke shave. But when the going gets a bit tough, I'll turn to this, a draw knife. I find this quite handy. It's a Mora splitting knife. It's really good for working around knots and stumps. Now that I've got this piece of yew into a vise, I can use this, a block plane, and I'm using it to take a bit more off the belly to make the thick end of this stave a little bit thinner. So I've now roughed out the shape of this bow, and I'm beginning to look at the back. It's still largely covered in bark, but at this end I've removed the bark and started to scrape away some layers of the sapwood. This is an offcut from the end of this yew branch. You can see the creamy coloured sapwood on the outside and the orangey coloured heartwood on the inside. It would have been really nice to make the bow from there, because the growth rings are quite narrow on that sapwood. That's because the branch came out of the tree like this, and that piece there bore the tension, the weight of the branch as it came out of the trunk. Unfortunately, in order to get a fairly straight run at this bow, I've actually got to make the bow from that piece there, where the sapwood is very, very thick. So I've got to work down somehow that sapwood to get it down to the thickness that I need. You can clearly see the sapwood growth rings here on this 30-year-old yew branch. The challenge for me is to remove 5 or 6 of these sapwood growth rings along the entire length of the bow. On this short section, I found the most successful technique for me was firstly to use the draw knife to remove the bark, secondly the rasp to work down the growth rings, and finally a cabinet scraper to smooth them down and tidy them up. So this is the progress so far on this rather wonky piece of yew. I've removed some of the sapwood from the back of the bow and I've flattened the belly simply to give me surfaces upon which to make some marks closer to actual bow dimensions. But in doing so, I've found all sorts of weak areas, places that it might split when I bend it, areas that might just go bang when I put it on the tiller. So is it worth it? I really can't say. It's not just the quality of the wood that's giving me headaches on this stave. It's finding a centre line for the string, because without that I can't make my guidelines from which I can work down further to the correct bow shape. It seems that I may have to heat bend the end of this stave to try and bring the tips in line so the string falls straight across the handle. I really do wonder, is it worth it? Now this yew stave is a massive 81 inches in length, but I'm going to leave it like that for now whilst I put guidelines on the bow. I can always shorten it later. Okay, so I've now worked down this yew stave to approximate bow dimensions, but I'm still troubled by this kink in the end of the bow. It's given me real problems trying to get a decent string line. So there's only one option left for me now, and that is to heat the bow up and try to make it bend so the tips line up. And that's my next job. I'm working boiled linseed oil into the area of the stave that I'm going to heat up, hopefully avoiding scorching the wood. And to provide the heat, I'm using this. Okay, so it's been about 20 hours now since I started to heat bend this yew stave. Let's have a look to see whether or not I've been successful. Okay, so there it is. Let's try and see whether we can get a nice straight string line. Not perfect, but a lot better. So this is my Wonky Yew Longbow so far. But will it bend? Will it go bang on the tiller? Will I, as a novice bowyer, let this wood down? Or will it, as a wonky piece of yew, let me down? Only time will tell. I'll see you next time.